Lachi Rachi Dead Scare Entertainment. Welcome back to Dead Scare Draws with Pierce Horvath. I'm your host, Pierce Horvath, and this is part one of the Munsters 2022 piece that was recently featured by Dan Roebuck and Sheri Moon Zombie. Let's get into it. Alright, so originally when I did this piece, it started out as a very rough thumbnail, and I was so excited once I was interested in the poses to just get into it, and then I'm like, oh wait, I could totally record this for Dead Scare Draws, so you guys get an exclusive look into the whole process practically of how I went about creating this piece. Now, this is going to be the most tutorial type of video that you're going to see coming from Dead Scare Draws. Essentially, I come on here to have a conversation with you guys, but in this case, I wanted to make sure that this one is where I'm actually teaching you something. And today's focus is shape language. This is what this part is going to be about. It's about really focusing on the iconography of your poses, your characters, the backgrounds, basically all your main elements, what makes this compositionally sound. Okay, again, there's no such thing as a super perfect composition. But I do want to make sure that when I draw these characters, you know for a fact that you're looking at Lily, Herman, and Grandpa, without a doubt. And if you notice, like now, the proportions on Lily are in the style of that idealistic look that came out of the 50s and 60s. I mean, look at Yvonne DiCarlo. She was the epitome of the feminine physique of the time. And then too, Fred Gwynn. When you've seen him in the show, he's nothing but a series of like boxes and cubes and long cubes, just square. And that's great because you have like these very feminine, beautiful, graceful lines of beauty that make up Lily, but then you also have like this boxy character that kind of harkens to the clumsiness and sort of the square attitude of Herman. But then you got Grandpa, who's just all these expressive, bold lines that come in curves, and some of them cut. And there's a lot of points. He's very angular compared to the other two. So with him, you see energy. And if you watch him during the show, you watch Al Lewison's performance, there's so much energy that comes from him. He's very expressive with his lines and his actions. And that's why, too, when you watch the show, the original, which I mean, I'm a huge fan of, if I had to put my vote on, essentially, if I would be a Munsters or an Adams like diehard fan, totally it's got to be Munsters. Now if we're talking the movies, like television wise, Munsters hand down. But if we're talking films, I gotta be honest, the Addams Family from the 90s, good luck trying to remake that, trying to beat that in terms of like a spooky family. Now, I'm going into the background at this point. I'm kind of happy with the rough. Now, notice I'm working with a very big brush for all these elements, for the characters and for the background. It'll get a lot more technical later on. Later. I think I might be still hungry. Anyways, now, originally I was going in and creating the living room, which you saw I was kind of starting to rough out at first, but then eventually said, that's not the ticket. I realized that the front door is one of the most iconic things about the film, because if you look at the intro, when Herman comes crashing through that sucker, it's an immediate recollection. And now I'm placing in these characters, and notice how, because of the expressiveness of these big, bold lines, because again, the majority of my work focuses on personality, focus on character, illustration, emotion, acting. I'm not necessarily very big on the backgrounds, but this is something that I wanted to actually take a little bit more time and take into account more of the interest, the visual interest in the background. This was kind of like one of the challenges I gave myself. So if you notice, when I go in to actually start this background, the number one rule that I told myself was no completely vertical or horizontal lines in this door in particular, because I wanted this to be visually interesting. I wanted there to be this sort of linear dissonance. So like if you think of music, because I'm a musician as well, I play violin, guitar, and I sing. If you have two notes that are a semitone, meaning like C and C sharp, and you play them together, there's sort of like this, like you get this very off-putting or dissonant sound. Now you can do the same thing with lines, essentially, but what that does is when you create things that aren't necessarily completely straight, you create this sort of vibration, and almost like it almost takes on a flow, an odd flow of its own. And I made it a point throughout this background not to place in any even symmetrical lines. The symmetry comes from using asymmetrical lines and forms and just visually balancing them to create the symmetry. So it's kind of contradicting, but if you visually understand where I'm coming from, this is a more of an advanced technique that I'm speaking of. Like eventually in your own work you'll notice this, especially if you're a fan of the UPA style of drawing that came out of the 50s and 60s. That's where I draw the majority of my inspiration from. That's where the majority of my work in freelance, as well as, you know, like my other commissions in general, the majority of them come from that sort of school of thought. And again, even look, and just like now some of the panels on the wood on the door, none of them are completely symmetrical, and there's no perfect squares or rectangles. Everything for the most part has a little bit of something off. Even like now with these shutters that you'll see later on, because I just kind of roughed them in just to rough them in, and I figure, oh, I'll mess with that in ink later. The idea is, and even like now with the lion heads, I realized within the composition you're barely going to see these lion heads, if at all. So I wanted to keep those forms simple, and again drawing back to the idea of the UPA and just placing them in. As you can tell though, just from the way I drew this lion, I don't really spend too much time drawing lions. I should. You know, maybe somebody should commission me for a lion type piece. Give me a challenge. How about that? Let me work with some like ferocious felines or something along those lines. And again, even with the door handles, symmetrically asymmetrical. Now, if any of you, hopefully you've seen the trailer by now for this film that's coming out in September of 2022. So if you're watching this in the future and that year is far gone, thanks for stopping by. I really appreciate it. So you're actually looking at a work of history at this point. Otherwise, if you're watching this prior to the film or when the film is just about to come out, which I thank you so much for coming by, please like and subscribe to the channel, because we love seeing familiar faces and we love interacting with you all here at Desker Entertainment. We literally feed off of your energy. We're not complete vampires just yet, at least from the business standpoint, but at least with a little bit of the energy that you give us, we're able to sustain our living. Now, if you notice towards the top, I just went in and kind of laid in a few of those boards. Later on, I thought back to what I did there, and I'm like, that's a boo-boo. That completely goes against my original intentions of symmetrical asymmetry. And notice how I keep changing between colors when I'm looking at my roughs, is because I want to be able to picture these things in blocks. That's why I'm filling these in, and I want to see how these shapes play against the background, and how I could then place these characters to complement the background and vice versa. And this took me the longest to learn and to accept. But when you are in this rough of stage, it's okay to be sloppy. Please, if you are a young artist, an intermediate artist, even advanced artist who has this tendency to want to be super polished from the get-go, unless you truly have the brain of a master artist, a genius of some sort of prodigy, don't torture yourself with needing perfect lines from the get-go. Think about your major forms. Think about how you want these shapes to play with each other first, and let it be messy. Look at how messy Lily's dress is. Look at how messy and like how basic Herman's legs forms are. I mean, it's barely their boxes. He's basically just a bunch of boxes, but it tells me just enough. So when I go in now with my pencil and I start to tighten up these drawings, again, the key word is tighten, because you are working loosely in the beginning. And even then, you notice how I'm using some of these forms, and some of these are going to, especially with the fingers, they're going to be very light and focusing on creating three-dimensionality. The personality starts to come out into inks. Once I have the general idea, once I place a black or a solid line around something, that's when you start to see the personality of the lines come out, and they just complement the forms. They just add like the icing on top, essentially. And one thing that I gave myself as a personal challenge and goal a while back was to really focus on rendering drapery, because the majority of my studies back in college at DePaul, as well as outside of that, prior to working in animation in general, I loved working on anatomy. I loved working on the figure without clothes. Which, I mean, some people make a great living off of drawing nude people. And hey, if I can make a couple dollars that way, why not? Hey, more power to whoever's over there commissioning that stuff, and even more power to the person who can draw that and make that dime. But for some of us who like to keep things a little bit more general audience, I'll put it in those terms, you gotta learn how to make clothes look believable. Now, notice when I'm going in and I'm drawing both Lily and Herman, there's a constant dance between the two characters, because one of the difficult things in illustration, and especially in animation, is creating believable contact between characters. This is why a lot of times when you talk to animators and they ask about how they choreograph fight scenes, some of them do watch fight scenes, but a lot of them actually watch dance scenes, because it's about timing, and it's also about learning where the contact comes from and how they can use gesture and angles to evoke contact. And see, the great thing about this, and about Lily's character in general, is she's very gentle, she's very light with her touches, she flows, she's ethereal, essentially. So that's why even with her like little caress of Herman's cheek, you could tell there's a little bit of like a daintiness behind it, and that's very much what Lily was in the television show. And even from the trailer, if you watch Sheri Moon's performance, she's trying to channel as much of Yvonne as possible, and I think she's doing a rather good job. I can't wait to see the film, honestly, because growing up, I was never the one for the, and I love when people say this, because to me it blows my mind. We will say the classic slashers, because in my mind this is still like 1960 some, and I'm referring to the 20s and 30s and 40s in terms of my classics. But that's what makes Dead Scared Dead Scared. No shame and no... I'm not here to trash slashers at all, but essentially what I'm trying to say is that style is key, essentially, to what makes up this particular look, and also gives it that lightheartedness, because even in these classic monster films from the 20s to like the 60s, they were tasteful, at least for family audiences. And that's the type of entertainment I love. That's why the Munsters always worked so well with me, because I wasn't necessarily of the persuasion of gallons of gore and guts, which I love. Presently, I love that now. But growing up, I loved the lightheartedness and the suggestion of malice rather than the just outward expression of gore, of the grotesque. But if you notice, even when we look back and we kind of go back into the drawing here, the lines that I placed down are a lot more tighter. But again, the final look is determined in the ink lines. And at this point, it's a dance around essentially what lines I'm comfortable with handling and what lines I'm sort of warming myself up to. Because like now, when you notice between these two, I'm pretty much happy with the way that these two are contacting each other, the way we have this interaction between their bodies. But then also, because me, going back to what I said about studying figures and working mostly with anatomy, drapery is something that till today is the bane of my existence. But I noticed in the show, and like the fabric itself of her costume, of Lily's costume, it's this very, very light, very wrinkly texture. So when rendering out the swirl, essentially, if you look at this, it's almost like if you were like kind of like wringing out a cloth of some sort. How there's that nice twist in the forms. I wanted to get that vibe going with that. Almost Grecian. If you look at a lot of the Roman and Greek later statues, how there's so much care in the rendering of the drape, in the chiseling of the drapes. I wanted to bring a little bit of that into her because she is this sort of image of horror beauty. And it's true, she is. She's one of those horror femme fatales, even though we never really see her do anything malicious on camera, that just brings that nice mixture of like spooky and sexy together. So at this point, I'm purposely isolating these two because I know that their interaction is the key part. Because for me, if you look at the majority of my art, Grandpa is just what I draw every day with a little bit of a different face. And I remember when I was rendering Herman's face here, trying to get Jeff Daniel Phillips' likeness was a little bit of a challenge. I'll be honest, it was a little bit of a challenge. But eventually, with a little bit of work, I was able to kind of get something that I was happy with. And again, just working on some of the details, refining some of the pencils here. because it'll make it for a little bit of an easier transition once I get into the inks. So again, I place this solid color behind the pencils, so it allows me, while I'm drawing, to squint and look at what I'm creating and see if it plays well against the background, and if I need to make any adjustments like I did with Herman's profile. So now we're going to actually start on Grandpa. And surprisingly, maybe to you guys at least surprisingly, but to me it was a little bit of a no-brainer, but he was obviously the easiest of the three figures to take care of, only because, one, I've drawn him before in the past, even though this is Dan Roebuck's likeness. Essentially, I've drawn the Grandpa character before, so the major shapes are more or less caricatured into some bigger features. And I do like the fact that we have the mustache on Grandpa this time around, because if you go back to the original Bram Stoker's rendition of the character of Dracula, he had a mustache. A long white mustache that covered up the protruding fangs under his ruby red lips. I'm paraphrasing, very roughly paraphrasing from the book. But from the rest of this, it's Lugosi from the neck down, basically. With a little bit of some, 60s pizzazz that I like to add in. But it's true. Once Lugosi placed in the tux, or the tails, that was it. Our version of a vampire, of Dracula as a character, has forever been changed, and good luck, because anybody who's wearing anything other than that, it doesn't fit. It just does not fit. And to go back into a little bit about the show, I loved the contrasting personalities between Herman and Grandpa, because Herman's very careful. I wouldn't say he's methodical, but he takes a little bit more consideration to the things he does. He takes a little bit of time to maybe think, well, maybe is that the best thing to do? He's more worried about his actions. He's a gentle giant. So he knows that if he acts brashly, there are consequences. Although sometimes he doesn't necessarily see them immediately in front of him. But then you have Grandpa, who's the know-it-all. He's got a solution for everything, which is great. I love that about him, because although he has a solution for everything, and he knows in his heart, at least he feels, at least he believes, that he's right, that he can do no wrong, and that he's got it all down. Like, I remember there was a particular episode where Grandpa decides to leave the house, and he takes on a magic act at a little speakeasy type bar, club downtown. And Herman and Lily are searching for him for a great deal of time, and suddenly they see an ad for him in the local newspaper. They go down to see him, and he's about to do a really big trick where essentially he locks himself in a chest, and he's gonna free himself afterward. And Grandpa, being pretty rough in terms of his, being out of season as a magician, he's locked in there. So Herman has to come in, undo him essentially. And he's like, oh, well, you foiled my plan. I was fine. Don't worry about me. I got everything. I had everything under control. But, we all know the truth of it, essentially. But, again, that's his flaw, and that's what makes him an interesting character, because sometimes we wait to find out what he's going to do, how he's going to solve his problems, and how, eventually in the mix of this, how Herman and Lily and Eddie all get into the solution of what's happening. Even Marilyn too, how she ends up involved in all this other stuff. Although I will say, she was kind of a very one-dimensional character. I loved Marilyn, but I would have loved to seen more throughout the series, playing with her and how she somehow mixes into the family, even though she was the white sheep of the family, essentially. I would have loved to see how she really brought out her inner Munster, regardless of her beautiful outward appearance. So now I've roughed in everything with the pencils, and again, the key here is knowing that what I'm doing with the rendering is focusing on, what I did was I focused on the major shapes first, the shape language. Like now, the beautiful hourglass figure for Lily, and these very delicate flowing lines for Herman, these boxy sort of angular shapes that kind of fit into each other almost like Legos or like Lincoln Logs. And then for Grandpa, these bold, angular and curvaceous lines that evoke energy, essentially. And then now I'm going back in and just kind of looking at how I did the background, and this is when I start getting picky with the inks, because there's so many brushes out there that once you place it down, it's like, oh, it's a digital brush. I make it a point when I create my artwork to try to give as much of a traditional look to my work as possible. The goal is to have people sit there and question, is this digital or is this a traditional piece? Obviously, for the sake of time, with the way that I colored this, as well as some of the other touches, you can tell this is a digital piece. But at the same time, I give the amount of care and attention to the details that you would see in a traditional piece. And again, now looking at all these lines, go ahead and notice that barely any of them, if not any of them, are completely symmetrical and hit those completely vertical or completely horizontal lines. Because even if you look at that line again down the door, that's not completely straight up and down. It's not on a perfect 90-degree angle. And I purposely made it a point when I was inking this to add a little bit of variation in the thickness of the lines as well, to create a little bit of that visual interest. So when things were a little bit more of an interior detail, like say for example it was receding into space, I made it a point to make sure those lines were just a tad thinner, whereas the ones, like the forms that were essentially coming at you, were a little bit thicker. Now, I did break my rule of just, making sure everything was, angled in some way with these little shutters, because I realized that I would have had to go through and just really render the heck out of all those little shutters, and I said I'm not here for that. So I made my job a little easier, and rather than just doing all these uniform, equally spaced shutters, I said, here's how I could make in between. And I kind of added those variations between the lines to add to the ricketiness of the outside of the background. And even in the case of the lions here, if I'm not mistaken, because it's been a minute since I've drawn this, what I did was I purposely did both of these, and if my memory serves me right, I made sure to add some variation to both of these so that both of them didn't look the same. And again, now I went in and I actually inked kind of post, essentially, because there are some, you will notice throughout this tutorial, there's jumps in between some of these steps in the process. I could record the majority of it, but not everything. It's kind of tough keeping up with all that stuff in the midst of the thralls of creativity. But we are nearing the end of this piece, at least part 1. So thank you so much for watching. I cannot wait to take you through the rest of my process, and I hope you subscribe to this channel, follow us on Instagram, on Facebook, and hey, check out Dead Scared Entertainment on TikTok as well. I'll see you guys later. Bye.